May 23, 1963. The Oregon Diner, South Philadelphia. A small man, 5'5", walked into the crowded restaurant. Someone was sitting in his booth. The man asked politely for the booth. The person sitting there refused. An argument started. The small man grabbed the butter knife from the table. He stabbed the 24-year-old longshoreman to death. His name was Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. And this single act of violence over a booth would eventually destroy 50 years of mob control in Atlantic City. The foundation, when Nucky built an empire. To understand how Atlantic City became a mob stronghold, you need to go back to 1920, the year Prohibition started. Enoch Nucky Johnson was Atlantic County Treasurer, a Republican political boss, the son of a former sheriff. When the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal across America, Johnson saw an opportunity. Atlantic City's location was perfect, a coastal resort town between New York and Philadelphia. Ships could anchor offshore and transfer illegal liquor to smaller boats. Johnson made a decision. Prohibition would not be enforced in Atlantic City. Hotels openly served drinks. Nightclubs flourished. Casinos operated without interference. Tourists flocked to the city. They called it the world's playground. Johnson took a percentage of everything. Every gallon of illegal liquor sold. Every gambling operation. Every brothel. His income reached $500,000 per year, equivalent to about $8.5 million today. He alloyed himself with major mob figures: Arnold Rothstein from New York, Charlie Luciano, Johnny Thorio, Benny Siegel, Meyer Lansky. In May 1929, Nucky hosted the Atlantic City Conference. Crime bosses from across the country gathered at the Ritz-Carlton and Ambassador hotels. Al Capone attended, Bugs Moran, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello. They discussed territory disputes, how to end violent bootleg wars, how to organize crime nationally. Some historians believe this conference created the foundation for the National Crime Syndicate, and Nucky Johnson was at the center of it all. For 20 years, from 1920 to 1941, Nucky Johnson controlled Atlantic City completely. The police answered to him. The politicians answered to him. The mob answered to him. Then in 1941, federal prosecutors convicted Johnson of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But even with Johnson gone, the machine continued. The transition, when the machine survived without Nucky. After Johnson's conviction, New Jersey Senator Frank Hap Farley took control of the political organization. Farley served in the New Jersey legislature for a record 34 years, from 1941 to 1971. He was the longest-serving boss of Johnson's organization. Under Farley, the mob's control continued. The gambling, the corruption, the payoffs. Atlantic City remained the place where vice thrived openly. But by the 1960s, things were changing. Atlantic City's economy was declining. The glory days of the boardwalk were fading. The city needed something to revive itself. In 1971, the political machine was finally broken. Dr. Joseph McGann defeated Farley in an election. For the first time in 50 years, Atlantic City's government was no longer controlled by the Johnson-Foley political machine. But that didn't mean the mob was gone. They were just waiting for the next opportunity. The opportunity: 1976 casino gambling. In 1976, New Jersey legalized casino gambling in Atlantic City. The goal was economic revitalization, jobs, tourism, tax revenue. What actually happened was an explosion of mob activity. Construction companies, labor unions, service industries, everything needed to build and operate casinos. And the Philadelphia mob was perfectly positioned to take advantage. The Philadelphia mob family, also known as the Bruno family, controlled South Jersey. Their boss was Angelo Bruno, known as the Docile Don, because he preferred negotiation over violence. He ruled for 2 decades, from 1959 to 1980. It was a period of peace and prosperity. Bruno banished violent members to Atlantic City. One of them was Nicodemo Scarfo. Remember the man who stabbed someone over a booth in 1963? That was Scarfo. After killing the longshoreman, Scarfo pled guilty to manslaughter. He served about 10 months in prison. When he returned to Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno was furious. The murder had drawn too much attention. Bruno didn't tolerate reckless violence. As punishment, Bruno banished Scarfo to Atlantic City. At the time, in 1964, Atlantic City was a backwater, past its glory days, economically depressed. Scarfo was essentially being exiled to nowhere. But then, 12 years later, casino gambling was legalized. Suddenly, Atlantic City wasn't a backwater anymore. It was a gold mine. And Nicodemo Scarfo was already there. The rise, when Scarfo became a power. Scarfo spent the 1960s and 1970s building connections in Atlantic City. He ran gambling operations, he made connections with local unions, he positioned himself. When casinos started being built in the late 1970s, Scarfo's concrete company, Scarf Inc., got contracts. Developers needed concrete. Scarfo provided it at inflated prices. With union cooperation, he controlled. He intimidated construction companies into buying from him. Money started pouring in. Then, in 1980, everything changed. On March 21, 1980, Angelo Bruno was shot and killed outside his home in South Philadelphia. Bruno had been boss for 21 years. His murder was ordered by his consigliere, Antonio Campanigro. Campanigro thought he would become the new boss. He was wrong. The Mafia Commission had not approved Bruno's murder. Killing a boss without permission was a violation of the most fundamental rule. In April 1980, Campanigro was found dead. His body was in the trunk of a car in the Bronx. He had been tortured, shot multiple times. $300 in bills was stuffed in his mouth and anus, a message about his greed. Philip Chicken Man Testa became the new boss of the Philadelphia family. Testa chose Scarfo as his consigliere. For less than a year, Testa ran the family. Then, on March 15, 1981, a nail bomb exploded under Testa's front porch. Testa was killed instantly. The murder was orchestrated by Frank Chicky Narducci and Peter Casella, another power grab. Scarfo saw his opportunity. He approached the Genovese family. He had a close relationship with Genovese consigliere Louis Bobby Manna. Scarfo told them his suspicions. Narducci and Casella killed Testa to take over the family. The Genovese family set up a meeting. Casella confessed. Narducci was killed. Casella was banished to Florida. That left Nicodemo Scarfo as the clear candidate for boss. In 1981, at age 52, Scarfo became boss of the Philadelphia crime family, and he immediately changed everything. The brutality, a new kind of violence. Angelo Bruno ruled through peace, through negotiation, through cooperation with other families. Scarfo ruled through terror. From 1981 to 1989, Scarfo's reign was marked by constant, brutal violence. He murdered rivals. He murdered associates. He murdered anyone who showed the slightest hint at disloyalty. On December 16, 1978, before he even became boss, Scarfo and his associate, Nick the Blade, Virgilio, murdered a judge, Judge Edwin Helfant, an Atlantic County Municipal Court judge. Why? Because Helfant refused to cooperate with them. Virgilio was facing murder charges. Scarfo offered Helfant $12,500 to give Virgilio a lighter sentence. Helfant refused. So, Scarfo and Virgilio shot him to death. This was the kind of man Scarfo was. He murdered a judge over a bribe refusal. When Scarfo became boss in 1981, the violence escalated. He promoted his nephew, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, the underboss, in 1986. He demoted the old captains. He replaced them with younger, more violent men. This angered the old guard. Men who had been well positioned under Bruno suddenly found themselves passed over. It also angered South Jersey mobsters who were furious that Scarfo was allowing New York crime families to operate in Atlantic City. Despite Atlantic City being Philadelphia family territory, Scarfo gave the commission and New York families permission to operate there. Why? Because he needed their support to maintain his position as boss. But this created resentment, internal conflict, anger, and Scarfo's response to any opposition was always the same: murder. The Christmas murder, when flash and glitter came to Philly. On December 16, 1980, just before Christmas, something happened that exemplified Scarfo's new style. John McCullough, boss of the Philadelphia Roofers Union, was in the kitchen of his house in Bustleton. There was a knock at the door. A man stood there holding a poinsettia, a Christmas delivery man. McCullough opened the door. The man pulled out a gun and shot McCullough to death. Law enforcement later learned why McCullough was killed. He had tried to take control of part of the Atlantic City Bartenders Union from Scarfo. That was it, a union dispute. And Scarfo had him murdered on Christmas with a poinsettia. This was Scarfo's style: public executions, flash, glitter, terror. Testa and Scarfo brought blazing guns and violence to the Philadelphia mob. Bruno had operated quietly. Scarfo operated loudly. And the violence continued for years. The Ricobene War, when the old guard fought back. Harry the Hunchback Ricobene was a well-respected, long-time Philadelphia crime family member. He had been a made man for decades. He was in his 70s by the early 1980s. Ricobene didn't like Scarfo. He didn't like the violence. He didn't like being passed over for promotion. So, Ricobene started a war. From 1982 to 1984, the Ricobene faction fought Scarfo's faction. Scarfo's men hunted Ricobene's crew. Ricobene's men retaliated. Murders happened constantly, on the streets, in restaurants, in homes. Eventually, Scarfo's superior numbers and ruthlessness won. Rico Bean was arrested and convicted. His crew was decimated, but the violence had drawn enormous attention from law enforcement. The FBI was watching, federal prosecutors were building cases, and inside Scarfo's own organization, people were starting to break.
The Informants, when fear turned to cooperation. Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramandi was a Scarfo enforcer, a hitman, someone who carried out murders on Scarfo's orders. But Caramandi started to believe that Scarfo was going to kill him. Scarfo was paranoid, egotistical. He saw threats everywhere. In 1986, Caramandi was indicted for his role in an extortion case. He made a decision: cooperate with the government or die. Caramandi became an informant. He testified against Scarfo and the entire organization. His testimony was devastating. He described murders, extortions, the structure of the family. Then, in 1989, something even more shocking happened. Philip, the crazy Phil Leonetti, Scarfo's nephew and underboss, flipped. Leonetti had been Scarfo's most trusted associate, his family, his right hand. But Leonetti was facing life in prison after a RICO conviction. He decided to cooperate. Leonetti's testimony destroyed what was left of the family. He knew everything. He had participated in everything. He was Scarfo's nephew, and he told prosecutors all of it. The convictions, 1988 to 1989. Between 1987 and 1989, Nicodemo Scarfo was convicted 3 times. In 1987, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit extortion. He received a 14-year sentence. In November '88, he and 16 associates were convicted under RICO: racketeering, murder, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and drug dealing. The jury found Scarfo guilty of ordering 9 murders and 4 attempted murders. His victims included Judge Edwin Helfand, an Atlantic City concrete contractor, a Philadelphia drug dealer, several mob associates, and the son of one of his oldest mentors. Federal prosecutors called Scarfo a remorseless and profoundly evil man. In May 1989, he was sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. 2 weeks earlier, he had been sentenced to life in prison for the 1985 murder of bookmaker Frankie Flowers. Those convictions were later overturned. Scarfo and 7 others won a new trial and were acquitted, but the 55-year RICO sentence stuck. Nicodemo Scarfo would spend the rest of his life in prison. The family destruction, when Scarfo's son was shot. On October 31st, 1989, Scarfo's middle son, Nicodemo Scarfo Jr., was dining at Dante and Luigi's restaurant in South Philadelphia. It was Halloween night. The restaurant was crowded. A masked man walked in and shot Nicodemo Jr. multiple times. He survived, but the message was clear. Even Scarfo's own family wasn't safe. His oldest son, Christopher, had already changed his name legally. He wanted nothing to do with his father's business. His youngest son, Mark, had been taunted for years by classmates about his father's criminal activities. On November 1st, 1988, during his father's trial, 17-year-old Mark Scarfo attempted suicide. He hung himself in his father's concrete supply company office in Atlantic City. Mark didn't die immediately. He fell into a coma. He remained in that coma for almost 25 years before dying in 2014. A father's violence had destroyed his own son's life.
The aftermath, what was left? By 1990, the Philadelphia crime family was shattered. Scarfo was in prison for life. His underboss had flipped. His top enforcers had become informants. Over 20 people had been murdered during Scarfo's reign. Atlantic City, which had been controlled by the mob for 50 years, was finally free. Not because law enforcement had gotten smarter, not because new laws had been passed, but because Nicodemo Scarfo's brutality destroyed the family from the inside. He had murdered so many people, created so much fear, that his own organization turned against him. The informants weren't motivated by justice, they were motivated by survival. They believed Scarfo would kill them, so they killed him first, legally, through testimony. The union control, how the mob lost Atlantic City. 2 successive presidents of Local 54, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union in Atlantic City, were forced to step down because of their ties to Scarfo. In 1990, following a civil racketeering suit by the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, a federal monitor was appointed to run Local 54. The goal? Rid it of mob control. The mob's grip on Atlantic City's labor unions was broken. Scarfo's concrete company lost its contracts. The extortion rackets ended. The casinos, under federal oversight, could no longer be infiltrated by organized crime. Atlantic City, for the first time since 1920, was not controlled by the mob. The irony: the man Bruno exiled. Angelo Bruno had banished Scarfo to Atlantic City in 1964 as punishment. Scarfo was too violent, too reckless, too dangerous. Bruno wanted him out of Philadelphia. But by sending Scarfo to Atlantic City, Bruno accidentally positioned him perfectly. When casino gambling was legalized, he was already there. When Bruno was murdered, Scarfo was in the right place to take power. And when Scarfo became boss, he destroyed everything Bruno had built. Bruno's 21 years of peace and prosperity were replaced by Scarfo's 9 years of violence and chaos. The irony is perfect. The man Bruno exiled eventually destroyed Bruno's entire legacy. The expert opinion: it never recovered. George Anastasia, a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter who covered the mob for decades, wrote extensively about Scarfo. In his book, Blood and Honor, Anastasia describes Scarfo as a greedy, ruthless despot who reveled in wanton, ruthless, and senseless violence. The Philadelphia Daily News called him the undersized Atlantic City man with the oversized temper. After Scarfo's death in prison in 2017, Anastasia said something that perfectly summarized Scarfo's impact. His management style decimated the organization. It never recovered from the violence of the 1980s period. That's the legacy of Nicodemo Scarfo. He didn't just go to prison, he destroyed the entire Philadelphia crime family, a family that had existed since the 1920s, that survived Prohibition, the Depression, World War II, multiple wars with rival families. Scarfo destroyed it in less than a decade.
The comparison: Bruno versus Scarfo. Bruno ruled from 1959 to 1980, 21 years. During his reign, the family was stable, profitable, peaceful. Bruno avoided violence. He negotiated with other families. He kept law enforcement attention minimal. His nickname was the Docile Don because of his preference for peace over conflict. Scarfo ruled from 1981 to 1989, 8 years. During his reign, the family was chaotic, violent, self-destructive. Scarfo embraced violence. He murdered rivals constantly. He drew massive law enforcement attention. His nickname was Little Nicky because of his short stature, but there was nothing small about his violence. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Bruno's approach kept the family strong for 2 decades. Scarfo's approach destroyed the family in less than 1 decade. The question: why did Scarfo rule this way? The interesting question is, why was Scarfo so violent? He wasn't stupid. He knew that violence drew law enforcement attention. He knew that murdering people would eventually lead to informants. So why did he do it? Multiple sources describe Scarfo as paranoid and egotistical. He saw threats everywhere. He trusted no one, and he believed everyone was plotting against him. And his response to perceived threats was always murder. He once said, while watching his soldiers tie up the body of an associate he'd ordered killed, "I love this. I love it." He enjoyed the violence. He reveled in it. That's not strategy. That's psychology. Scarfo was a man who enjoyed killing, who used violence not just as a tool, but as an expression of power. And that mentality destroyed everything he touched. The final act, death in prison. Nicodemo Scarfo spent the last 28 years of his life in federal prison. He was serving a 55-year sentence. He would never see freedom again. On January 13, 2017, Scarfo died at a federal medical center in North Carolina. He was 87 years old. No cause of death was officially released, but multiple sources reported it was cancer. His death barely made headlines. The man who had terrorized Philadelphia and Atlantic City for years died quietly, forgotten. His 3 sons had diverged paths. Christopher changed his name to distance himself from the family. Nicodemo Jr. was serving 30 years for racketeering and fraud. Mark had died in 1988 after spending 25 years in a coma from his 1988 suicide attempt. His nephew, Philip Leonetti, was in the federal witness protection program after testifying against him. Leonetti later wrote a book, Mafia Prince, Inside America's Most Violent Crime Family and the Bloody Fall of La Cosa Nostra. The family Scarfo ruled was gone, destroyed, never to recover. The lesson? When violence destroys what it's meant to protect. Organized crime in America was built on a principle. Violence should serve the organization, not destroy it. You use violence strategically to eliminate threats, to maintain discipline, to protect territory. But you don't use violence recklessly. You don't murder people indiscriminately. You don't create chaos. Scarfo violated this principle completely. He used violence not to protect the organization, but to satisfy his own paranoia and ego. And in doing so, he destroyed the very thing he was supposed to lead. The Philadelphia crime family had survived for 60 years before Scarfo became boss. It lasted less than 10 years under his leadership. That's the lesson. Violence without purpose is just destruction. And destruction eventually consumes everything.
The legacy, Atlantic City today. Today, Atlantic City's casinos operate under strict regulatory oversight. The New Jersey Casino Control Commission, established in 1977, monitors every aspect of casino operations, background checks, financial audits, continuous surveillance. The mob can't infiltrate the casinos the way they once did. Atlantic City is no longer the world's playground where vice operates openly. It's a legitimate gaming destination, regulated, monitored, controlled. The 50 years of mob control, from Nucky Johnson in 1920 to Nicodemo Scarfo in the 1980s, are over. Not because the mob decided to leave, but because one man's brutality made the organization unsustainable. Scarfo didn't just lose control of Atlantic City, he destroyed the organization that controlled it. That's his legacy.